As you may recall, a few weeks ago, Governor Kathy Hochul announced a pause on the congestion pricing program that was supposed to be going into effect in New York City this summer. Since that announcement, the governor's decision has faced criticism from supporters of the program who argue it would have greatly helped the city decrease traffic, help the MTA, and assist with the state's climate goals. To learn more about the opposition to the pause, we sat down with Michael Gerrard, professor of law at Columbia University. Here's that conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Gerrard.
My pleasure to be with you.
Now, we know a few weeks ago, Governor Kathy Hochul announced an indefinite pause on the congestion pricing program in New York City. That was, of course, met with a lot of pushback because the plan was supposed to go into effect this summer. Before we get into some of the possible legal challenges of that pause, I wanted to get your perspective on why the governor has the power and the authority to implement an indefinite pause on the program.
We don't think she does. A state statute that was passed in 2019 said that the MTA shall implement congestion pricing, notwithstanding any other provision of law. We don't think that the governor has the authority to supersede that state law.
Are there any potential state laws that the governor may have potentially broken by implementing this pause?
Well, we think that she violated the state law that required the MTA to implement congestion pricing. We think that she also violated the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that requires all state agencies to do what they can to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we think she also violated the environmental rights provision of the New York State Constitution, which the voters added in 2022. There may also be some other violations of the laws on disability rights.
In terms of the MTA board, we know that they first voted to approve the congestion pricing plan. Of course, that was meant to be implemented this summer. But then after the governor announced the indefinite pause, they then voted to implement that pause. So was there an opportunity for the board to potentially stop the pause from being implemented if they had voted down the governor's decision?
Well, the congestion pricing program requires the approval of the State Department of Transportation. They need to sign a form with the Federal Highway Administration. The State Department of Transportation, acting under the direction of the governor, is refusing to sign the form, and the MTA can't make them do that.
And then in terms of the potential challenges in terms of the state being able to meet its climate goals, what would that look like in court?
Well, one of the purposes of congestion pricing was to reduce air pollution from motor vehicles. Doing without congestion pricing means there will be more of that air pollution than there would have been otherwise. And that makes it even harder for the state to meet its climate goals.
And is this something that would solely be fought on the state level, or is there an opportunity for this to go as far as federal court?
This would be at the state level. We expect that this will be challenged in state court.
And what would that process look like of it being fought?
Well, it would be a lawsuit filed under a procedure called Article 78, which is supposed to be an expedited process. So I think we're talking about probably a few months, but certainly not years, unless there are appeals that drag on.
And who are the groups that are potentially going to be fighting this? Are these transit rights groups, or are these climate groups, or a mixture of the two?
There are a lot of different groups that are involved and that are interested in participating in the lawsuit. Groups representing riders, groups representing residents of Manhattan and the outer boroughs, groups representing businesses, disability rights, environmental groups. It's remarkable how many groups were appalled by the governor's actions and are very interested in joining the litigation.
And, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the legal positioning of other states, such as New Jersey, that have said that they're hoping that the congestion pricing pause becomes a long-term thing. So if that were to be successful, how would that implement the way that things are figured out in New York State?
There have been a couple of major sets of lawsuits challenging congestion pricing, mostly saying that there wasn't enough environmental review. One of the sets of lawsuits was dismissed 2 weeks ago by the federal district court in New York. The other is still pending before the federal court in New Jersey. If the court in New Jersey rules for the plaintiffs, it doesn't mean that congestion pricing can ever happen, but it means that some more processing is necessary in order for it to happen under the National Environmental Policy Act.
And of course, there were some supporters of the governor's announcement on the pause to the congestion pricing pause. One of them being teachers' unions who said that the tolls were regressive and discriminatory. Is it too early to say that they are a potential early winner in terms of the governor's pause on the plan?
Well, I guess if they are happy with the plan, they think that they're winners of it. Although I suspect that more teachers go to work by subway and bus than by car. Uh,
Right.
but I guess the leadership had a different view.
hmm And are you looking to work with any lawmakers to help with the legal challenge against the pause? I know, for example, New York City Comptroller Brad Lander has been pretty vocal about his opposition to the pause. Is there an opportunity to work with a comptroller or any other state lawmakers?
Yes, absolutely. We are actively working with Brad Lander's office right now, and
hmm
we're in touch with several other members of the state legislature and the city council and Congress.
And what does that working relationship look like?
Well, Brad Lander's office has helped us organize some of the meetings. They had a big press conference at the municipal building a couple of weeks ago. Um, it may be that some of these elected officials will join an amicus brief that will probably accompany the litigation and helping in other ways.
hmm And we know that there were millions of dollars used to help with the infrastructure to help with the congestion pricing plan. That, of course, won't be used because there is a pause. So, is that something that will be included in terms of the legal challenge?
Well, we'll certainly mention it that a lot of money has been put into this. It's not clear whether the fact that they spent that money would itself be a legal basis for challenging what was happening.
And I know you don't have a crystal ball or anything, but where do you see this all panning out in the years or the months ahead in terms of congestion pricing?
Well, there's such good arguments for congestion pricing to proceed. It resulted from many years of study and analysis and advocacy. And I think one way or the other will have congestion pricing, although it didn't happen on June 30th as the state law required.
And what would that look like?
Well, I think it would be again congestion pricing as originally planned. There's some reports that there are negotiations about maybe lowering the toll, lowering the amount of revenue that has to be gathered. That would still leave a big hole in the MTA's capital budget, but we'll see how it washes out.
And do you think there's an opportunity to come up with a plan in which all parties are happy?
I I don't see a plan in which everybody's happy because congestion pricing intrinsically involves charging some people money, and the people who have to pay money are probably not going to like it. So I don't see a win-win-win situation. I think there will be some unhappy people, whatever happens.
Absolutely. Well, certainly a lot to look forward to, but we'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good talking to you.
And we were speaking with Michael Gerrard, professor of law at Columbia University. And for more on the pause on congestion pricing in New York City and the possible legal challenges, you can visit our website. That's at nynow.org.